Center opened in September of this year and hired me. I'm Alyssa Emery, a graduate research assistant at the RMC and also a PhD candidate in educational psychology. I have a budding interest in qualitative research, and there's a tiny component in my own dissertation. So I'm looking forward to learning from this presentation alongside all of you. If we need more chairs, we've got plenty here along the side. We can also pull some out. No need to stand here, just get yourself settled. We have some information about the Research Methodology Center that you can grab here on your way out. It was launched at the behest of the deans to build capacity in researchers, including faculty, graduate students, and postdocs, research staff here at the college. So we aim to support you in all of your research needs. That includes consulting, as well as skill building workshops and opportunities like this to discuss ideas with some of our experts. We're lucky, I think, at OSU to have a number of expert qualitative researchers with us. We have 3 here today. We aim to have a variety of perspectives represented here today. So we have a professor from each of our departments who are expert in different kinds of qualitative methodology, but they're not the only ones. Just here to start our conversation. So very briefly, I'll kind of overview how we're going to spend the next 90 minutes. It's pretty informal because we do want it to be a discussion. So I'll introduce briefly our panelists. They'll take an opportunity to tell us a little bit more about their own expertise and experiences. And then I've got some questions that I've worked out with the panel ahead of time. They'll each respond to those questions. But if it sparks something in your mind, if you have a question that comes out of their discussion, go ahead and just let me know by raising your hand. We'll try to get you that microphone. After we work through the questions that I've generated, we'll open it up to other questions that may be on your mind. All right? So we'll start here with Dr. Keely Pratt. She's assistant professor in human science, joined our faculty in 2013, is the former clinical coordinator of the Couples and Family Therapy Program, now works closely with the Schoenbaum Family Center, Nationwide Children's Hospital, and also has served as an editor or reviewer for over 12 journals. Those include the American Journal of Public Health and Pediatrics. So thank you, Dr. Pratt, for joining us. Dr. Susan Jones, in the middle there, is professor in Higher Education and Student Affairs program here at in Ed Studies, so my department. She's also a program chair. She's won several awards, including NASPA's Schaefer Award for Academic Excellence as a graduate faculty member, and several other awards regarding her scholarship and teaching. And then Dr. David Bloom, there on the end, is an EHE Distinguished Professor in Teaching and Learning. He's director of the Center for Video Ethnography and Discourse Analysis and also co-director of the Columbus Area Writing Project. These are just very brief introductions. They may not even be the projects that are closest to the panelists' hearts, so I'll let them now take an opportunity to just go down the line and tell us a little bit more about your research and your expertise.
All right, thank you for the introduction. My name is Keely Pratt, and I am by far the most junior person on this panel in terms of experience. So
I think that's a statement about us.
I said experience. Full professor's assistant professor. So I'm very happy to be here. My work is typically mixed methods, and so the things that I'm going to talk to you about today certainly involve a qualitative component. Most often, they've also involved a quantitative component. I got interested in qualitative research from my background in marriage and family therapy. So I am a therapist by training, which lends itself very well to conducting focus groups and interviews, which you would imagine having that interpersonal skill set. So I was really interested in working with some vulnerable and underserved populations for which qualitative research was very well matched, and that's one reason why I got so interested in qualitative methods. I got my PhD in medical family therapy, which is a little bit different. So most of my research focuses on working with chronic illness and the effects of chronic illness on the family system. Most recently and commonly for me, that's been with pediatric obesity and adult weight management. And at Schoenbaum Family Center, for example, I've set up some different health clinics and have helped to facilitate health care services for the Wyland Park area and specifically at Schoenbaum. Trying to think any other specific things you think would be helpful for the group to know?
I think that's fine.
All right.
Great. Welcome and thank you all for coming, and particularly thank you to Alyssa and Dr. O'Connell for sponsoring this out of the Methodology Center. It's probably not a stretch to say that many methodology centers highlight quantitative approaches. So to have this opportunity because of their direction is great. So I'm Susan Jones, and I am a faculty member in the Higher Education Student Affairs program here in Ed Studies. I, bless you, received my PhD a while ago at the University of Maryland in the Counseling and Personnel Services Department. But before I got my PhD, I was a dean of students for a number of years and was trying to figure out whether or not to pursue a PhD. So I actually took some classes at the University of Vermont, and one of them was a class from Dr. Corinne Glesney on qualitative research. And at the time, she was working on her very first edition of a qualitative research text that has kind of stood the test of time. And it was a phenomenal course. I learned a lot from her. Her approach was an ethnographic one, but I got a chance to do kind of a mini research project. Those of you who've taken my qualitative class will see her mark on my assignments. But then fast forward to my doctoral program, I was interested in how college students come to understand themselves, develop a sense of self when social identities like race and culture and religion are taken into consideration. And I found my way to grounded theory. I think I was the only second person in my program who had done a qualitative dissertation, so I found that I needed to do a lot of reading and learning on my own. I did take a class in phenomenology, which was phenomenal, mostly because we did a ton of writing and I love to write. And I just have continued with a research program that primarily uses qualitative approaches. I got known for grounded theory, I think, because I was one of a very, very few. And one of the things that happened was that then everybody thought they had questions that demanded grounded theory, which really wasn't the case, but we'll talk more about that later. But I have also done studies using narrative approaches and case study. And as a faculty member, I've probably have a little bit of an unusual path in that after being a dean of students for a number of years, I became a faculty member here for 9 years, then to Maryland for 5, and now back here for 6. And I'm not going back to Maryland. No plans. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for the invitation to come and to share with. I appreciate it greatly. The work I do probably is best understood as sitting at the intersection of ethnography and discourse analysis. Both words are very vague and cover a whole series of ground, but nonetheless, it's probably the best way to understand the work that I do. I think about ethnography and discourse analysis as grounded in linguistic anthropology, interactional sociolinguistics, and both of which grounded in a philosophical approach that sometimes goes under the name of social constructionism, right? So you got to hear the ending to that, right? Right, constructionism, right? Much of the work I do comes off of and is based out of the theoretical writings of Michal Bakhtin, Vladimin Voloshinov, and Ludwig Wittgenstein, among other people who have talked a great deal about language, particularly language as a social and cultural phenomenon. When I was first asked to be on this panel, my immediate reaction was, well, I don't divide the world up into qualitative and quantitative. That dimensionality, that sort of continuum just has no meaning for me. I don't see the world in those terms. And I think most people who are grounded in anthropology don't see the world in those terms. They see the world quite differently. And I think when you approach things from an anthropological or what we sometimes call linguistical, although that doesn't mean theoretical linguistics, a more sociolinguistic sort of approach, the issues have to do with the material nature of the phenomenon with which one is working, and that is culture and language, as opposed to thinking about it elsewhere. And the questions become, how can we get our hands around that? And however you can, you should. And so I tend to think about what I do not so much in terms of methods, but much more so in terms of perspective. And the methods will figure themselves out. I rarely worry about methods. I mostly worry about perspective. I mostly worry about the frameworks I bring and trying to keep those frameworks open, trying to keep those frameworks evolving as I engage in my work as well, and try to enjoy the dialectic that often occurs when you have various kinds of frameworks that are coming together. So locating it there, not so much worrying about methods. Methods take care of themselves, at least in my experience they have. With regard to my particular work, a lot of my research has focused on language and literacy in classrooms and between classrooms and communities. I particularly look at the use of language and literacy, written language, if you will, spoken and written language and nonverbal language to get things done. How do people use language to do things? How do they use language to learn? How do they use language to build social relationships with other people? How do they use language to construct knowledge and understanding? How do they do knowledge to do mean things to each other? How do they do knowledge to repair the mean things they do to each other? And so forth. So I'm very interested in how people use language and what they use it for and the complexities with which they do that. Most recently, I've been looking at issues of how people use language to construct time. I know that sounds very weird to most people. What do you mean construct time? Time isn't constructed, it just is. That's a very interesting position to think that it just is, since I think that it's socially constructed, as do a number of other people, so maybe something to talk about. I also have been looking recently, over the last maybe 5-6 years, at how people in classrooms and elsewhere use language to construct arguments, and what it means to construct arguments, and how we might better understand rationality and various forms of rationality and the construction of rationality within the context of the teaching and learning of argumentation, both in classrooms and in elsewhere. So I think I'll stop there.
Questions about things you still would like to know about these professors, perhaps their favorite color? All right. So what I'd like to do now is open up the floor for some questions that I've thought about in conjunction with our panelists. And again, if these spark any questions that you might have, just let me know by raising your hand. And also know that if you need to build up the courage, we have some time built in at the end for your questions. What I'd like to do first is just pose this question to the panelists and have them go down again, maybe starting this time with Dr. Bloom and working right closer to me. What are some markers of quality work in discourse analysis, Dr. Bloom?
Yeah. Well, in the kind of work I do in discourse analysis, I think we might start with the understanding that the attention is focused on how people act and react to each other, as opposed to what an individual does. That is, the fundamental unit of analysis is people acting and reacting to each other. So how does one look at that? How does one capture that, as opposed to some other notion of it? And how well can you capture that, right? And so I think the notion of markers of quality work is in the way in which people take a look at that, the way in which they document it, and the way in which they help understand it, and the way in which they both situate it and contextualize it ethnographically as well. And this, I think, is an interesting issue, because we are so used to just looking at what people do when they act, right? But take an event like this. One could say, analyze what I'm doing as if there were no people here. And yet I am quite clearly, carefully watching all of your nonverbals. That's right, keep shaking your head, smiling is very good, right? And I am modifying what I'm doing based on how you are reacting to what I am doing, which is reacting to what you are doing, which is, right? And you get it, right? And how do we document that? How do we carefully analyze that in ways that have some sense of resemblance? So I think those are one of the markers of qualitative research. And it all gets back, if you will, to the nature of the argument one is making, right? That is, using that unit of analysis, how do we make a clearly warranted argument, and what evidence we use to make a persuasive argument about what is happening based on carefully documented ways in which people act and react to each other at multiple levels and in multiple ways.
Thank you. Dr. Jones, what are some markers of quality work in narrative analysis or grounded theory, either, whichever you prefer?
Well, first let me say that I think that you'll find that some of the markers that Dr. Bloom mentioned transfer to other approaches. And to kind of continue where he began, with narrative work, the unit of analysis typically is on the individual and the meaning that individuals are constructing about a particular phenomenon. So this would be constructivist as opposed to constructionist, which is a whole nother topic. But in terms of markers specific to narrative, which is what I thought about, I can talk about grounded theory another time or later. One is to really understand what one is talking about when they use the term narrative. There are some who would argue that there's a distinction between narrative inquiry and narrative analysis. And really, analyzing narratives is what a lot of us do. Whereas narrative inquiry refers to a particular perspective and approach. So I think I look, and what I expect of myself is to read deeply in terms of methodological text to understand those frameworks and perspectives that Dr. Bloom talked about. Many people are drawn to narrative because they think that it's about telling stories. And that's certainly an element to it, but that's not all there is to it. And so what is the story that's being told? This is part of making the case for your approach and providing the evidence for what it is that you found. So what is the story that you are after? How did you determine that that story was important? How is the story told? Who's telling it? There are multiple narrators with you, the researcher, being primary. Because narrative analysis involves interpretations, and the interpretations are coming from the researcher. So being clear about who you are as a narrator and the kind of story that you're telling is critical, and relates to, again, this idea of perspectives. That there are some narrative researchers who will connect narrative approaches to other theoretical or philosophical perspectives, like critical race theory or feminist theory, which then, again, tells the reader your particular analytic lens in terms of telling stories. So I think it's recognizing what it is that you're doing as a narrative researcher, understanding the distinctions, thinking about stories as data and narrative as analysis and interpretations, reading deeply in terms of these approaches, and being clear about what story you want to tell, who's telling it, and why that's important.
And Dr. Pratt, what are some markers of quality work in focus groups?
Mm-hmm. So focus groups are interesting because there is a focus group framework and approach to analyzing focus group data, but it is also can be theory specific. So you can lend to grounded theory or phenomenology, which is a little bit less common, but certainly grounded theory is very common when looking at focus group data. So a lot of what Dr. Jones was saying is very true when thinking about focus groups as well, especially for the facilitator of the focus groups to be able to situate themselves within the questions that they're asking, how they're asking it. In my world, in the therapy world, we call that self of the therapist, right? You need to know who you are, how you interact with the world, your own beliefs before you're going to go and ask other people about theirs, right? Because clearly it's impossible to not be biased. So we put those biases out there. Same thing for a qualitative researcher when you're going to ask questions. You really need to be able to situate yourself in your own beliefs, knowing that you can't abandon those. It's impossible. You can try to navigate them with the help of professionals a little bit differently when you ask your questions. So certainly what Dr. Jones was saying rings true for focus groups as well. The other marker, well, some other markers of focus groups that are really important to consider is why is the focus group being done versus another approach? So a lot of people, like focus groups is fairly common. Like I printed something off from RWJF that I can show you. Like it's very common with federal funders, and it's very common when thinking about evidence-based practice and practice-based evidence. However, with vulnerable populations, with sensitive topics, focus groups may not be the best option. Interviews might be, or group interviews might be. So it's really important when I see that somebody's done focus group work, I want to know how does the research question that they're asking and the population they're working with match with the focus group methodology. And I think a lot of times that's lacking. So I think that's really important to consider. Typically when you're conducting focus groups, the goal is to have that kind of collectivist thought, that group think. And so if it's the first time your question is being asked, it's probably not okay to do that in a focus group context. It's more appropriate to do that in an interview context, right? Because of the sensitivity of the question, perhaps, that somebody might get embarrassed because you're asking them or may have a reaction in front of other people. Another marker of focus groups that's important to consider is how homogeneous they are. So there's some different schools of thought where, for example, in my work with childhood obesity or with adults who are interested in bariatric surgery or in weight management, where you may put or ask any adult that is interested in bariatric surgery to be part of a focus group to talk about influences for them of why they would want to have surgery. However, some others would say you need to break the men into a group and the women into a group, or perhaps break them up by race, ethnicity, or perhaps break them up by age group even. So it's really important to me when I look at focus groups, how did they determine who would be their sample of their focus group, the homogeneity of it, and is that based on some kind of existing knowledge we have about that population and the sensitivity with the topic. I also mentioned being able to determine a match for what theory or what analytical framework you're using for your focus group data, because like I said, you can use different theoretical approaches. So for example, are they doing structured questioning or are they doing semi-structured questioning? Are they having some kind of a peer facilitator within that focus group who may be more familiar to your members than you yourself as the moderator? So the ways that they're structuring the focus group is really important to determine as well. And also, if I'm reading an article that I'm reviewing for a journal that's on focus groups, and it doesn't have any details about how the moderator was trained, I have some concerns about that. So I really want to know that this isn't, an undergrad that we're pulling out that wants to get research credit and we're saying, do some focus groups, right? We want to really make sure they're trained because by nature of asking people questions in person, it is a personal matter. And it could have adverse effects. So you really want to make sure that whoever's doing the focus group has been trained to do the focus group by somebody who's familiar with those kinds of things. I think that's
Mm-hmm. So I'll just open this up and you all can decide how you'd like to answer it. Is there anything that you wish those who are not expert in qualitative research methodology understood about reliability and validity in qualitative inquiry? Sure. So by nature, so we have this umbrella of research, right? And I totally agree with you that it's not necessarily always helpful or ever helpful to think about qualitative and quantitative as being separate entities. Now that I say that, I'm going to say with qualitative research. With qualitative approaches, though, you're asking questions differently, perhaps because we don't know the answers and we're not trying to validate something that's already out there. So the nature in which we are asking questions is a little bit more novel in terms of we are not assuming that we know the answer most of the time. There are some approaches where we would try to replicate something or see if something is true that we've seen before, but most of the time it's novel in the questions we're asking. So when we think about things like reliability and validity, we're thinking more about rigor and trustworthiness. How are we coding our data to keep our data consistent? How are we looking at our data to remain true to what the participants are saying rather than our own beliefs about the data? So things like member checking are common. So it's those kinds of approaches that are really important.
but I'm sure you guys can expand on that much
No,
more.
I mean, I think I just would echo that to continue this false dichotomy of quantitative and qualitative, which we so often do. But, well, let's just say see if David likes this better. Positivist research compared to interpretivist designs. Is that better, or is that still, you can counter this. Anyway, the purposes are different. The kinds of questions that you're seeking to answer are different, depending upon your worldview. And so the strategies are different. And so in higher ed research, you typically see this referred to as trustworthiness. How do you assure the trustworthiness of your findings? Which doesn't necessarily mean that you're guaranteeing truth. But that you have put you have used some strategies to try to get as close to what it is you thought you wanted to learn more about as possible. And oftentimes what I see folks do is they say that they have done things like member checking or triangulation of data, but they never say what they learned from that. And I think the underlying assumption is that they want the reader to think it all worked out fine. Everyone agreed. But it's actually more interesting when people don't agree. And so I think that what was the question? What would we want? Quantitative?
People who are not expert.
Not expert is to realize that there are some strategies in place that are meant to mirror or to be the counterpart, if you will, of reliability and validity using statistical analysis.
Sadly, I think, can I interject for a second? One of the things that a lot of times you get asked to cut from qualitative manuscripts
Right.
are the things that you're talking about too,
Right.
when you're going for submission. So that can, as important as I think all three of us would say that is, a lot of times you're also asked to cut that from publication, which is not good.
Yeah. I think the thing that I would want people who call themselves quantitative researchers and so forth to know about the sort of research that I and do, and people who do work similar to mine, is that the conduct of research is itself a language game. Not just what we're studying. We're not just studying language games, but the conduct of research is itself a language game. And because it's a language game, it is also at the same time a construction, right? And so it's worthy of reflecting upon that very language game in which we are ourselves engaged. And uses of the terms reliability and validity need to be interrogated the same way we would interrogate any set or use of terms that anyone uses in a study we are conducting. What are they indexical of? What do they really mean? What are the debates and dialectics about how they're using it? What have you decided to finesse, right? And how come those sort of terms don't actually apply to other people in the language games they're engaged in when they're conducting research? And what sort of are the nexus in the network of concepts that they are using, and how do they embody them with the various kinds of lexical items they use in their research? And so I come at it sort of as a different way. So if you will, I often think about researchers in some sense speaking different languages, right? And it helps when you're speaking a different language to first recognize you're speaking a different language and not pretend you're all speaking the same language. And then it helps to figure out how to translate into another language. And of course, anytime you translate, something is going to get lost in the translation, right? Try to figure out what that is that you're losing in the translation. And whether that's a translation from people who do other kinds of research and yourself, or whether it's a translation from the researcher community and its language games to the community of, say, teachers in classrooms or others, there is always translation going on, and translation is an art in and of itself and needs to be understood. So I think I would approach it that way.
That makes me wonder, Dr. Bloom, if you can provide an example of a way in which reliability or validity has been used to mean maybe two different things or many different things.
are you talking about how reliability and validity mean different, each of those terms means different things?
How you've seen it, no, not those two terms specifically, how they're different, but how you've seen those two words sometimes mean different things to different communities, outside of maybe the quant-qual paradigm.
Well, I think that, from my experience as an editor, I was the founding editor of Linguistics and Education, and I was also an editor of Reading Research Quarterly. When people try to talk about the quality of the research they do, whether they're using terms reliability and validity or things of that nature, or other sorts of terms to indicate the quality of the research they do, they often talk about systematicity. Sometimes they will talk about coding and the rigor of the categories in which they're coding and so forth. And I think that that's fine as far as it goes. But then I think something that I resonated very much with what Dr. Jones was saying about is that for those of us who have gone through that, have done that, our experiences, or at least my experiences, are always, those coding categories just don't always work. Those coding categories are supposed to be discrete and separate, and damn it, people just won't stay in their categories. And what they do just doesn't stay in there. And everything you've got something really narrowed down, people come along and do something different. Now in linguistics, we knew where the negatives were always supposed to be placed in sentences. And then come along young people and they invent a linguistic structure we hadn't seen before. The one in which negatives are always supposed to be located near the verbs, not, right? All right, what do you do with that, right? And so forth. So I think that, for me, the issue that I've had both as an editor of journals as well as looking at my own work is trying to understand what the argument is that is being made and how people are trying to warrant the argument about what they are being made and whether that sounds reasonable to a particular audience and or to a broad range of audiences.
Thank you.
Can I jump in for 1 second? This idea of sort of people not fitting in, or codes not fitting in the categories. I do think, and having just finished my required theories class for master's students, where they're always really quick to critique the old theories because, after all, they were based on a bunch of middle-class white males attending elite institutions, so therefore there's nothing good about them. That with kind of the rules, if you will, that's too strong a word, but the guidelines, the rules of some of these approaches like coding, I think it's important to understand what those look like before you break out of the boundaries. In the same way that I think before you critique, you need to know what it is you're critiquing in order for a critique to be sophisticated and robust. So I think when I'm working with my students who are doing dissertations primarily, and they want to immediately use a constructionist approach to their data analysis, it's like, well, let's first kind of figure out what it would look like if we didn't tear it all apart at the beginning. So just a little kind of cautionary note, I guess, about Breaking Bad.
So probably a nice segue then into my next question, which is, as a journal reviewer, what are you looking for in manuscripts that you accept?
Sure. For focus groups, again, I want to see what kind of approach they're taking with the actual focus group. So is there a theoretical lens that they're taking, such as grounded theory, such as phenomenology, to how they're interpreting their data, or that is informing how they're asking their questions too. That's an important part of it. And speaking of questions, I'm interested in seeing, where do they come up with those questions? So are those questions based off of something that has already been existing, and they're opening up the questions in some way to generate some kind of new knowledge on something, or ask a particular population about something that maybe hasn't been approached before? So how do they come up with their line of questioning and their method for questioning? How do they come up with their sample? So not only who is part of their sample, But how big is their sample size? So, you know, we can say that you can have as few as 6 people, but you can have less or more than that too, depending on what kind of questions you're asking. So that's not set in stone by any means. Also, how many different groups are they doing and what's the justification for that? So if they are looking for saturation of their data and they have planned to do 2 different groups and 2 different focus groups, and they've started to then analyze that data and realize that there are more questions than answers, which I think we always have. There's always more questions than answers, which is why qualitative is very fun. But are they going to continue to sample, or did they run out of money and that's why they stopped? It's important to know, like, why did they do what they did, basically. I also am interested in their experience with the topic. So in journal articles, it's common for them to say that the person who's doing the mediation of the actual focus group, what their experience is with the topic and with focus groups. So, for example, when I do focus groups with children who may be overweight or have an obese weight status, I need to say that I've worked in childhood obesity treatment for a decade. I've worked in residential sectors as well as school-based interventions, and that I've commonly worked with kids. Now, that doesn't take it to a personal level, right? It only takes it to a professional level, so it's hard to have people put that personal level in. But again, it's important.
A couple things, I guess, to add, and these may sound very common sense, but you'd be surprised how common they occur. And the first is to just make sure that what you submit is well written and impeccably prepared. I mean, to this day, I never submit anything that someone else hasn't read. By the time you submit, you're way too close to it. You care way too much about it. You think it's the most important thing that's ever been written. And so you need to make sure that it is really well written and that it does kind of satisfy the so what question. What's the significance? What's the contribution? I look for articles that are methodologically sophisticated and complete. In other words, I look for methodological citations. I look for work that's conceptually grounded. I mean, you'd be surprised at the number of articles that actually get published where an author says, you know, I did some interviews and I wrote some stories, and this is my narrative approach. And the reason why those things get published is because the people reviewing them don't know enough about good qualitative research to know that that's not a very robust approach. And then lastly, I think for now I just would say that I look for what I call a narrative thread, that there should be a thread that links all elements of the manuscript. So if you say you're doing a narrative inquiry, then your interview questions should be narrative in approach, and your analytic strategies should be characterized by a narrative approach, and the presentation of your findings, rather than having the methods section be kind of this siloed section that could fit, that's very generically written. So those are some of the things that I look for.
I think for those of you who are just beginning the process of writing for publication and thinking about, there are a number of very good resources you should consult. AERA has standards and guidelines both for social science research and research in the humanities. Both those documents are really worthwhile your time taking a look at them. The APA manual lays out various sorts of formats and things that should be included, as well as a relatively standard sequencing of those topics. So let me say that those are necessary, but not sufficient as far as I'm concerned for getting something published. Mostly you have to have something to say that's new and compelling. And if it's not new and compelling, you can do everything else right, and I'll reject it because it's not worth the time, anybody's time to read it. And one of the things I do as a reviewer is try to protect people's time. So what makes something new and compelling? Well, we all work within various intellectual communities. You should know your intellectual community. You should know what people are talking about. You should know what they've talked about already. What is new and compelling about what you are writing about, not for yourself, but for others to spend their time with? Okay? Now, I'll just give you one of my pet peeves. If I see another manuscript on identity, I think I'm going to puke. I can't imagine that there's anything left to be said from the 5 million articles already written on identity in third grade classrooms. And that's 5 million in third grade classrooms, never mind all the rest. So if you're going to write on identity, you really better have something new and compelling to say, right? Right? And not just say identity, right? Or whatever other sorts of topics fall under those rubrics. You have to have something to say that's worthwhile for others to hear. Yeah.
All right, so the opposite question then. What, other than sort of the negatives of what you said, would advance a manuscript for publication? What might also get a manuscript rejected for publication with you as a reviewer?
Not doing those things.
Not doing
For
those
sure. So lack of justification. So again, lack of justification for the method that they're using, for the approach that they're using. Limited references about what's been done with that population or on that topic before, not even just references about the method, but why are you using this approach with this population at this time? And without that very compelling argument about what's novel about it, but also what's been done before about it, it's really hard to understand the purpose of the manuscript. So that's a big piece. For me, one thing that I find really confusing when I'm reading a qualitative manuscript or even a mixed method manuscript is when I can't figure out how they coded their data. So if I can't figure out what kind of coding they did, whether they had multiple coders, when there was a lack of agreement, what did they do? If those kinds of things aren't clearly outlined, like you would have in a typical quantitative method section where those things would be clearly outlined, that's definitely a grounds for rejection in my book, if they can't provide that kind of detail. There are times too when, and you guys absolutely might disagree with this, I would like to see a number and a percent count for certain kinds of methods for coding strategies. So there will be times where I'll look at something, particularly within medical literature, and they'll say the majority of our participants agreed with X, Y, and Z. And then they'll say a few participants said this instead. I don't know what that means. So while that's helpful and the numbers shouldn't have to justify the argument that the authors are making, sometimes it's very helpful to have frequency and percent counts that go along with the data that they're talking about. And that's being asked more and more, I think, by journals.
I mean, yeah, just to reiterate, I think the opposite of the things that we said initially, but maybe to add two others. One is when there appears to be an over-reliance on convenience, even when that's not named, like a convenience sample, but that it's very obvious that the researcher has conducted their research in their own backyard, so to speak, without a justification for why that fits with their research questions. There may be times when your own backyard is an appropriate research context, but if I see somebody say, I don't have any money, and so therefore I'm going to interview the people down the hallway, that's not, I'm exaggerating slightly, but not a whole lot. There needs to be a justification for every decision, actually, that a researcher makes. I mean, you're making decisions every step of the way, not just with regards to sampling and participants, but so a justification, a rationale for decisions that you make as a researcher. And then I think the second thing, which is a little bit different, is that it's important to start, when you start out, to be both ambitious but also humble. When I see statements like, there has been no research conducted on this topic in the universe ever, I am exaggerating there slightly, but when people claim that they're the first to investigate a particular topic, that probably isn't the case, but the failure, I think, on the part of the researcher is to see how, even if their very precise topic has not been investigated, their approach to that topic has been informed by others. And to recognize the contributions that others have made to your thinking about a particular topic. So there's, if there is a bit of far-reaching claims that are made, that's a turnoff for me as a reviewer. And this may be too strongly worded, but kind of an arrogance that comes across that may not be intended. But when one claims to be the one and only, then that causes me to think differently about their research.
I think that going back to saying earlier, manuscripts need to have something to say. I think there are at least four ways that manuscripts have something to say. The first is that they add something to the knowledge base, to the extant knowledge base that wasn't there, right? Something substantive. Right? That's the first. Second way is they counter something in the knowledge base. They say, this is part of the knowledge base, and we don't think so, based on evidence and warrants. The third thing is to problematize key concepts, ideas within your field. Right? Here's a particular concept, and let me tell you why this concept is bankrupt, and how we should not only deconstruct it, but reconstruct it in this particular way, based on our work in the field and our warrants and evidence about why to problematize. And the fourth way it's been described in a number of different ways, so I'll try to describe it this way, is when you find an area that brings together different strands, either in integration or synthesis, or what some people have talked about as a third space, right? So there's been work in discourse analysis, and there's been work in cultural anthropology, maybe on particular issues that are having to do with, teachers and students socially constructing ways and definitions of learning. And your research suggests a way to pull these together and not just merge them together, but rather take them and use them as a basis for a new way of conceptualizing this particular phenomena. Right? So I think it's in those four ways, perhaps there are others as well, in which you can make a substantive contribution to your field. And that's what I would look for. And that's what would make me excited about a manuscript. And I would say, as a former editor, I would say a manuscript that comes in and does that, even if it does some other things wrong technically, as long as those technical things do not look like they undermine these contributions, potential contributions, I'll work with that author to see if those technical matters can be addressed in ways that nonetheless what they have to say can be maintained. Right? But if you don't have something to say, why waste our time?
So what are some common limitations of, let's say, focus groups, narrative analysis, discourse analysis, and what can researchers plan for or address in their write-ups?
The biggest limitation is time. Probably is that it takes quite a bit of time to So, I mean, this isn't secondary data you're working with, right? It's it's active data collection first and foremost, which takes time. It could be secondary data, I guess. You could be working to code data that's already existing, but the coding itself takes time. Most of the time you have more than one coder, so you have multiple coders, figuring out your congruence, and then being able to write up your results in a way that is representative of what your participants are saying. So it takes time. It definitely takes time. It also takes resources, and that depending on just speaking about focus groups, it's one thing for me to have focus groups in this building. It's another thing for me to have focus groups in the community where my participants are, right? So being able to go to a place that's comfortable and I shouldn't say comfortable because focus groups aren't always comfortable. That's as comfortable as possible and convenient to participants is important. So a lot of times that's adjusting your schedule, and that's difficult as a faculty member, and I'm sure as a student. Another limitation is a lot of times, believe it or not, people may not want to participate in focus groups or interviews or your research, whatever your research is, so we have to incentivize them. And by nature of incentivizing them, that brings up the question of whether, how engaged are they with the topic versus the incentive that they're getting and the incentive that they're getting. And so I think that's a limitation of all of our research, but particularly with qualitative research where we're very purposeful about who we're sampling. And often the incentives for qualitative research are much higher than for quantitative research because of the time involved. So it's not uncommon for it to be as an incentive to be double that of what you would get for traditional quantitative survey research. And I think the last major limitation that I know of, but I enjoy this limitation, is that every time I've written on qualitative research, conduct qualitative research, I always have more questions than I have answers. So there's a million things I want to do as an offshoot off of what I've just published. Which is true with most research, but I think particularly so with qualitative, because typically my research tends to be with populations that are typically underserved and haven't been published on very much on the topics that I'm discussing with them. So there's a million things I want to do immediately, and again, that time issue gets in the way. So more questions than answers is a limitation, but also a really good limitation.
One thing just to say here, the idea of reciprocity, I think, in qualitative research is really important to consider. I mean, we're often asking a lot of people, and their interest in our topic may not be as great as our interest in our topic. And so, what does that kind of respectful relationship look like? And it may be incentives. It's also it's a relational process. And so thinking about issues of access and trust and rapport building, I think is critical before you kind of enter the field. I thought about this question a little bit differently in terms of what are the kinds of issues that reviewers who don't understand this approach raise. And so I'll just mention a couple of those. This whole question of bias comes up all the time in terms of a biased approach, the researcher's bias. And so it's important for you as researchers to think through what that means and the role of bias. The implication, obviously, is that if you're doing factor analysis, there's no bias involved at all. Thinking about that and having a response for that, and I'm not advocating that when you write up articles that you need to write it totally for the skeptics, because then you end up sounding really defensive. And rarely when you read a factor analysis study do you find somebody providing a lengthy rationale for factor analysis. But that said, I think that some of these hot button issues, generalizability is another one, small sample size. How can you possibly have anything to say when you just interviewed 12 people? I had, and it relates back to an earlier point that I made about understanding what you're doing and making the case. I submitted an article once And one of the reviewers came back and said, the author needs to explain more about grounded theory. See Susan Jones's work for an example. It's like, all right, I can do that. I know where she lives. But I cited Jones. But being transparent, I guess, is a way to say that more succinctly in your design. And one of our former colleagues, Peter Demerath, wrote an article where he talked about leaving breadcrumbs for your readers, that they can trace your path and see the logic, if you will, in the research process.
Well, I took the question, what are some common limitations of qualitative methodology? I took it from that point of view. And so let me mention two. The first is a claim or a frame or an argument in search of illustration. That is, it's clear that when the person started out, they already had the answer. And they were just looking for some illustrations to prove them right. Right? We have this theory. This theory tells us X. And see, I went into this classroom and there it was. Case closed. In my particular view, first, it doesn't add anything to the field, and secondly, I find that an abusive relationship between a researcher and the people and the places they are doing their research, and I find that highly unethical. It harkens back to some theories and views about, in many ways, people being cultural dupes and people being unconscious of themselves. So I find that problematic, and one does find that, not just in qualitative research, of course, but in many kinds of research. The other one, I think, is a debate that's going on in the field. And it's a field, I think, right across qualitative and quantitative. Oh, by the way, I wanted to mention something that you mentioned earlier. I also like numbers. Mm-hmm. And I don't find anything problematic about numbers. I find things problematic in the way some people use numbers, but numbers themselves can often be very helpful. And if they add accuracy and clarity, I'm all for them. I think they can be extremely helpful. But this debate I mentioned is a debate that can get characterized in many ways. One of the ways is to characterize it as a debate between hard phenomenology and soft phenomenology. Another way to characterize it is in terms of the ardency that one views schema theory in, right? And these are all the notions, basically, that who you are limits your ability to understand anybody else. That there's no possibility of actually being able to get outside of yourself and understand anything but yourself. Right? And we see that a great deal, actually, in a great deal of social science research, and in particular. And that's versus a side that says that there is the possibility not only of intersubjectivity, but also the possibility of empathy and also the possibility of understanding other people's views and perspectives. And this is the debate, I think, that is going on in some sense in terms of frames and theories of talking about methodology. How can we know, or can we know, beyond ourselves? And I think this is a defining debate. And I think when people take it for granted that their own positionality determines what knowledge of others may be, I think we are now on dangerous territory, because it suggests that we are fundamentally isolated and incapable of having relationships with others. And I find that problematic.
That sounds like an identity consideration.
That's what you mean by identity.
But I'm not in third grade.
There's one more limitation I should definitely point out about focus groups.
Please.
Because of the nature of focus groups, where you have more than one person, a lot of times when you are both coding but also reading data that's been published or reading about data that's been published, it's hard to, you don't know if you had one person that dominated that conversation necessarily because you have multiple people there. So both as a focus group facilitator, moderator that I've been many times, and also as somebody who's coded my own data and coded other people's data or co-coded data, it can be really challenging when you have one participant or two participants that really dominate that conversation, because then you're stuck with the situation of, am I representing 2 people or am I representing 7 people, right, if that's your group. So that is a really difficult limitation to deal with in focus group methods specifically.
Okay, so this will be my last question, and I am a former 5th grade teacher, so I'm used to people just sort of calling out or whispering to their neighbors. You guys have been very polite. I would encourage you to start thinking about your questions for our panel now, instead of listening, I suppose, to my questions. So what are some of your favorite resources, such as books or journals or websites, for novice researchers or those who are interested in learning more about qualitative methodology? Books you've written yourself, perhaps?
Not me. Certainly for focus groups, you can look at Robert Wood Johnson website, and there's guides for focus groups, rationales for using them. Again, I come from more of the health, family science background, so that's something that I tend to go to for guides. Articles that are of high rigor that you've seen published are helpful. In terms of focus groups, you can also look at, help me with the name of this, it's the Cochrane Qualitative Consortium. Am I getting that name right?
Cochrane Collaborative.
Collaborative Qualitative Consortium. Is that what it is? CCQ?
Actually, I'm really thinking of the quantitative.
Yeah, so there's actually a qualitative one, which most people don't know about. So you can go on and look at the qualitative version of the typical Cochrane that you're used to, which has some great ways of looking at different reviews that have been done on different qualitative methods that have been put together. That's a great resource as well. And focus groups are a little bit more challenging too, because there are certainly texts to tell you or help you with moderating focus groups and coming up with your questions. But in terms of your theoretical underpinnings for your focus groups, I would go to your more traditional qualitative text like Dr. Jones's or some of those like Sharma's on grounded theory or different traditional qualitative texts.
And I think for introductory texts, I find that, and this is somewhat of an oversimplification, that there are texts that are well anchored in sort of the philosophical and theoretical frameworks, like the Handbook for Qualitative Research. And then there are texts that are more geared towards strategies, like developing good interview questions, analyzing data, coding. I grew up on Corinne Glesney's work, as well as Michael Patton, who I think his is called Qualitative Research and Evaluation, and it's in maybe the 4th or 5th edition now, at least. And his text, I find, I'd love to have coffee with him someday, because I think it's like the way he thinks spewed all over this book. So, he's got kind of orienting ideas, and then little exercises, and then little sidebars, which is where he kind of goes off on some kind of philosophical rant about something, cartoons. It's very engaging. Then in a little bit of shameless self-promotion, in this text that I wrote with my colleagues Basti Torres and Jan Arminio, this is in the 2nd edition, what we tried to do, this is geared towards folks in higher education. And what we tried to do was kind of a both-and approach, is to highlight some of the how-tos without forgetting the philosophical and theoretical considerations. So, yeah.
Sorry, the title is?
Negotiating the Complexities of Qualitative Research in Higher Education, published by Routledge. And this is 2014, 2nd edition.
Thank you.
Yeah. If you read it, tell me what you think.
Of course.
Can you say that again? Negotiating the complexities of
Qualitative research in higher education.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think in my field, most of the resources are books as opposed to articles or and so forth. There are a couple of very good websites. There are websites that are run by individuals. Toon Van Dyke has a wonderful website on discourse analysis, as does Jan Blommert, and they have some good websites. In terms of books, here we teach a year-long course on discourse analysis, and one of the requirements of that course is that people read. How many books do am I requiring? Like 8 books or something like that? And the idea is because there's so many different perspectives that you should read multiple books so you get multiple perspectives. I think if you get 5 people who have a book on discourse analysis together, you're probably going to get 8 different definitions of discourse and discourse analysis. So you need to read multiple books to understand the multiple ways that people are coming at that topic. Like everybody else, I have a book or two, and you're certainly, I'd be glad if you plus the 2 other people in the world who have read it decided to read it. But there's some good books by people both here and in Europe. In Europe, Jan Blommert, Deborah Cameron come quickly to mind to their books on discourse analysis. Here in the U.S., books by Ron Scollin called Mediating Discourse Analysis, which is an interesting particular take on it. And there's just a plethora of books on discourse analysis. I would also suggest that people need to go back to roots. And the roots of discourse analysis are in the ethnography of communication, in anthropological linguistics, and in interactional sociolinguistics, in the work of Del Himes and the work of John Gumpers in particular. And I think it's really hard to understand discourse analysis if you're ahistorical, right? So I think you need to understand that we are all in a process of evolution. And so the moment that we're in now will be history to something 10 years from now. And so it's important to, I think, understand that history.
Can I add one thing real quick? I think it's also important because of the amount of work that likely you'll be doing when you graduate is to look at different disciplines in their qualitative research. So don't be afraid to go beyond your typical discipline. So I've taken qualitative classes in nursing, which I found particularly helpful, sociology, public health, and then in human sciences and family science. And everybody certainly has similar core beliefs about those, but how they sample rationales for using different kinds of methods are different. So I have found that to be particularly helpful when working with large grant groups or different kind of research groups where there are different disciplines presented, that I can talk about those methods in a way that people understand why I'm doing them that's unique to the population we're studying.
Now I'd like to open up the floor for your questions for our panel. Yes, please.
My question is maybe a little too specific, but I'll throw it out there anyway, since we're with such experts on the topic. And it does touch on almost several of the questions, the issues raised. I'm curious to know your thoughts in grounded theory and narrative analysis and discourse analysis of the tactic of using devil's advocate type strategies in interviews when you're interested in content. What I mean by devil's advocate, I mean eliciting disconfirming data by throwing out a question that specifically provokes like a contrary perspective.
When you're asking the question or when you're interpreting the data, when you're analyzing the data?
When gathering data.
Well, that's a great question, and probably there's more than one way to think about it. I mean, it strikes me that one way to think about it is that it depends on what you're after. I think I always err on the side of respect for the person, the individual, the participant, and so would not want to get into a situation where I was purposely deceiving or provoking in a way that could result in harm, potential harm. I think there are ways to ask questions differently. We tend to think about those as probing questions. So you lead with a question, and if you might then ask a follow-up question that may be a little bit more specific or gets the person to think a little bit more deeply.
You can ask for other opinions that haven't been stated. So does anybody think differently about this topic, or has anybody thought about that in a different way?
How did you come to hold that idea? So I think there are ways to be, quote, devil's advocate, but they need to be respectful and not hold any potential for harm. It's impossible to, well, that's another topic.
Yeah.
Okay.
I always tell people when I'm training them to do focus groups that you need to be very purposeful when you're doing a leading question. If you're using a leading question that you are trying to generate some kind of information that you may not be getting already, you need to be very purposeful about it. And so we practice that, and that's one way to kind of help them in those situations, but it's still tough.
There's an article by Mike Bainham about a decade ago on interviewing styles.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the styles he identifies there is called the seminar style. So rather than see yourself as actually interviewing somebody, you're actually having a mini seminar with the two of you discussing a particular topic. You know, some people have been saying about this that this is true, and other people have been saying, where do you come off on this?
Mm-hmm.
And they say, well, you know, and sort of I was thinking, and so it's more a seminar with the two of you which you record. And that's a way to put out a contrary idea, right? But in the context of it being actually, if you will, a seminar where you were talking about those ideas. Yeah. So.
So we've talked about a lot of different kinds of theories and methods to approach qualitative research, and I'm wondering what you see as the place and value of appreciative inquiry in any of the qualitative research that you do or that you've seen. What kind of stands out as a best maybe example of the place and value of that, or if there isn't one?
I don't have a lot of experience with it. I have read some things about it, and my view with my limited knowledge at this point is that it seems to be most effective in practice-based contexts, maybe action research, where you are working with a group of people who have identified a particular issue or problem that they want to solve, and the process of appreciative inquiry, as I understand it, engages all people in that process in a way that suggests that everybody has expertise and everybody has value and everybody's committed to the actual project. I know that it's been, appreciative inquiry has been applied to particular professional contexts like academic advising, that on some campuses advisors are being trained in appreciative inquiry, but that's less about kind of formal research than how is it that you engage with your students in kind of information getting strategies. I don't know, but others may know a whole lot more than I do.
I know that it's something that I'm less familiar with other than knowing what it is. It's not something that I've done before. Where I have seen it done is with community-based participatory research, which again, action research, right? So there's a group out of the University of Minnesota. They have a research kind of hub that is a community-based and family participatory research. I'm butchering the name a little bit, but they have published on some things on appreciative inquiry within CBPR projects. So that would be a good reference for you to go to.
I do think, similar to what we've talked about earlier, that if you are interested in using appreciative inquiry, that you should probably keep in mind that those reading it may know a whole lot less and may have some ideas about it. I'm thinking back to, I was on a dissertation committee at Maryland where the student did a phenomenological study, and she had somebody on her committee who was only did kind of statistical analyses, and she said that they were at a professional meeting and they both were drinking too much scotch, and she realized she had asked him to be on her committee and he had said yes. And so at her defense, he asked the question, how, I mean, he had no scotch at the defense, but he said, how is this different from group therapy? Well, you know, this is her dissertation defense. But she had a great answer. So being prepared for those kinds of assumptions and biases about particular approaches is really important.
What do you think?
I think that in honoring your participants, especially if you're serving underserved if you're investigating research in underserved populations, that it's one good approach, because it doesn't really threaten, but it builds on the strengths that are already kind of present within that focus group. So I also think that in education there's an over-dependence on constantly pinpointing what the problems are, what problems, and that more often than not we could look towards what some people believe the solutions might be, if they're not even experts, maybe, and to consider some of those solutions.
This is a nice segue from the scotch drinking example. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about ways to write qualitative research for fields that are traditionally more quantitative, trying to get some buy-in or having reviewers take the work seriously, even if it's not within their normal framework. Journals that are specifically saying we want more qualitative work, so we're not.
Megan and I are writing a paper.
Yes.
Something that I struggle with a lot. I'm sure we all have. So most of my research is in healthcare, and perhaps you've noticed that most of that's also quantitative in healthcare journals. So what I find is I, in a lot of ways, take a grants writing approach to it, and thinking about what the argument is, so outlining what my purpose is, and then based on the quantitative research, that is, I don't call it the quantitative research, right? I call it the research that's out there, demonstrating what holes there are. And because there are those holes, really the way that we need to begin to fill those holes is with qualitative inquiry, because we don't have quantitative survey methods to be able to use that, or we don't have inventories that are created to assess that. So I guess I can give you an example. I recently submitted an article on weight talk and teasing within couple relationships. There's no inventory to assess weight talk and weight teasing within couple relationships. So how do we ask about it, right? And there's only a handful of publications that have been done on the topic that I've been able to find, and my co-authors have been able to find. See? Not the only one. So what we needed to do was to actually ask couples individually, because it's sensitive, right? What weight talk and weight teasing was like in relationships, how they defined it, when it happened, when it did happen, what was their reaction to it, to get evidence on where we go from here. So eventually we'd love to have an inventory that might assess the frequency of weight talk and teasing in couples relationships. We're not anywhere close to that. So we had to be able to articulate that argument.
I'm going to guess that when you and I first came out, your experience was like mine. There was no place to publish ethnographic or quality. Matter of fact, there was a joke at the time that the heart of ethnomethodological research was no method, which is, sort of the letters in the middle of it, right? Okay. Sort of my sense of all of that was that people went to publish books and book chapters because you couldn't get into the journals. And the fact of the matter is, if you have a journal and journal editors that have a particular limitation on how they see the construction of knowledge and the building of a field, you're not going to get published. And don't waste your time. There are many other journals where the editors are interested in the argument you are making and how you warrant that argument and are not closed-minded about it. The field has changed radically in decades, right? That's since we've been out, right?
Yeah.
Remarkably. The people who have gone before you, and actually the generation just before us, did a remarkable job of opening up the field in ways it had never been opened up before, making opportunities for us and many more opportunities for you. If you got something worthwhile saying, and you think the editors of a particular journal are too narrow-minded to appreciate that you're saying it, go somewhere else. There are plenty of places these days. They don't deserve it.
Another thing you can do is, if you have a particular reason, which I'm sure you do, about conducting qualitative research that has been published in a textbook, for example, like in my research, I use a citation often that says if you're working with a underserved population, that this particular qualitative method is very helpful or is more helpful than other methods. So you can also make sure and use appropriate citations to demonstrate why you're using the method that you are with the population that you are. So if they come back and say, why aren't you using XYZ inventory, you have that argument.
Yeah, a little strategy that I learned is to actually use the phrase consistent with a citation so that it doesn't appear like you're just making this up.
Yeah, they do that a lot with focus group numbers too. Why don't you have 10 groups that you did of 10 people each?
Right.
And so you always have to say consistent with, Brown 2004, I think is what it is. You can have up to 6 people or up to 4 to 6 people in a group. So,
And I do think that on the upside, that good writing, good ideas and good writing are very related, and that good work, I'm hopeful, emerges as what gets published. But needing to kind of make the case for that, particularly when you think you're looking at a journal where fewer qualitative pieces have been published.
We probably have time for maybe one more question.
From an international student's perspective, what are your thoughts on the non-English speakers qualitative research? Do you see any, because from my experience, it is okay or fine to have like international researchers who do quantitative research. But I totally agree that the conduct of research is a game of language. So what are your thoughts, or what are the things that you've been seeing with international research?
Really, really pertinent question. So I've been lucky to work with undergrad and graduate students that are international students with English as a second or third language or a fourth language. So the difficulty that they've experienced and talked with me about has been in the coding of the data and not being present when the data was collected. So when the data was collected and being able to see the participants and how they responded and have the nonverbal and the verbal match was very helpful. But in just having the and having the participants' words transcribed and coding that and not necessarily knowing the affect that went with it, whether that was a joyous affect or whether that was an affect that was more down, was more challenging, especially with some of the different, I don't want to say slang, but different jargon words that were used that may not be familiar. So it was more of a working hand-in-hand process to figure out those words that may not have been commonly used or known. But it was very successful. So, and again, with qualitative research, one of the great things about it is typically you have more than one coder. So it's an opportunity to work together as part of a team. But certainly, I appreciated the students that I've worked with being open and transparent about some of the challenges that they had and being able to work with them on those.
I know you said only one way.
Well, the director can.
So I found this panel really very provocative and thoughtful, and I appreciate all the effort that you put into it. I wondered if you could talk really quickly about some outlets for grants and funding for either graduate students or, say, new researchers in the field.
Please.
So I will say with every grant I've ever submitted, there's always a qualitative component. So, and that's part because of the nature of what I study, and that's also because I think mixed methods approaches are particularly intriguing to funders right now. If you are interested in practice-based evidence, so figuring out from the ground level what are the strengths, what are also the challenges and the problems that need to be addressed within a population, whether that be healthcare-based or education-based. There's a huge place for qualitative research and practice-based evidence. In fact, that's the gold standard for practice-based evidence. So I think any grants that you find around that, trying to think about specific funders, community-based participatory research, any grants that call for CBPR methods tend to be qualitative initially and go towards more quantitative and mixed methods as the project progresses.
Yeah, my comments will only be perceived as heretical in our contemporary context, I think, and that is that I have struggled as a PI, as a single researcher in getting grants for my qualitative research. I mean, I get feedback like, we're rejecting this, you're sampling on the dependent variable by proposing a grounded theory study, stuff that's like, I don't mean to be discouraging, but the way in is exactly as Dr. Pratt has said, and that is to get connected with projects where there are multiple methods and you carve out a piece of what basically is somebody else's project, which is also part of my issue with this, is that there's such pressure on us and growing pressure. The pressure now is not at all like it was when we first became faculty members, but you have to think about what's your research program going to look like, and getting on someone else's grant sometimes means taking a left turn to go in this direction because it's somebody else's project, and you become the methods person, which may or may not advance your own line of interest.
Yeah.
So it's complicated.
And as like a early stage faculty member, I can definitely echo that. So I am a qualitative methods person on multiple senior faculty grants. But I also have my own line of research that I'm trying to build as a PI, which is a mixed methods approach. It certainly has qualitative pieces to it. So yeah, it is. It's, as new faculty members, it's definitely a struggle.
There are several sources, but the first thing to say is that there are grant proposals that are fairly well defined in terms of topic and what they want, and then there are RFPs that are much more open, and you need to be sure you know which one you're submitting for in that. What quickly comes to mind is the Spencer Foundation's pre-doctoral student. One Ford comes to mind, Wennergren comes to mind. Those three come to mind quickly. Goal 1 IES grants come to mind as particularly good and receptive to research that is not oriented to reified variables. So I think there are places to look for them. There are also small grants that are available from professional organizations. In my field, NCTE has small grants. The Literacy Research Association has small grants. The International Literacy Association has small grants. The American Anthropological Association has small grants, many of which are targeted at doctoral students or at young scholars early in their careers. They're not very large, but they can be a good foundation and show and provide you the basis then, after having secured those, for moving on further to other kinds of getting the experience of what it means to write for a grant and to have a grant. Let me just say, I know there are other people in this room who've had grants. There are really 2 days to be happy about a grant. If it's a 4-year grant, it's 2 days out of, not each year, but over the 4 years. There's the day you get the grant and the day you send in your final report and you're done. All the other days in between are misery.
Well, on that note,